Hey, and welcome to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. Thanks for joining us again. We're here every week. We meet interesting people in dealing with topical issues, and boy, is this one topical.
Indeed. I don't know how you could have a more topical issue today, because this show, while we're taping it in advance of airing, it will air this coming Sunday, and we want to talk about the subject of impeachment. We've got probably the fellow that knows more about impeachment in the state of Oklahoma than anybody else, and probably beyond the boundaries of a good bit.
Yeah, I think on the surface level, we all know kind of what it means and what it implies, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a history to it, too.
Yes, Professor Joe Ty is our guest today, and he teaches constitutional law and the Constitution generally, and he's going to tell us, answer some of our basic questions, and certainly our questions will be basic.
It's all coming up today in The Verdict, and we'll be right back.
Soccer has been such an important part of my life. It's been my life for 18 years. It's an amazing experience to be a part of the Big 12 championship team in 2017 with the OSU Cowgirls. And looking back, it's one of the best things that has happened to me. I'm Lana Duke, I'm a medical student, and I'm Chickasaw. There's a need for physicians in rural and underserved areas of Oklahoma, and that's where my heart is. I definitely want to stay here and practice in Oklahoma and give back to the community that has given me so much. And I want to make my family proud, and Chickasaws proud too, and ultimately make other people have healthier, happier lives is what I really set out to do.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofenation.com.
When I came to work for the ODVA, I started realizing the opportunity to take care of veterans. It's a powerful thing when you realize that you are taking care of people that made history.
Working here is a calling. It's really, really important that they don't just come here to exist. We want to give them meaning to their lives. We try to make life happy and meaningful and fulfilled for our veterans.
Welcome back. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
As we talked about in the open, our guest today is Professor Joseph Ty, professor of law at the University of Oklahoma. He's actually a presidential professor of law there. Joe did his undergraduate work at Harvard University, did his law work at Harvard University. After that, he clerked for a number of justices and a judge as well. He clerked for Byron White on the United States Supreme Court, Justice John Paul Stevens on the United States Supreme Court, and at the 10th Circuit, Justice David Ebel, depending on, he'll straighten me out on how you pronounce his last name. As I say, he teaches constitutional law and the Constitution at the University of Oklahoma. He has a number of honors besides his teaching credentials and his respect in the legal community and generally. He has been named the outstanding professor at the University of Oklahoma a time or two, and he is very active in the academic community and recognized scholar. Joe, sure glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Back.
Yes,
your second
back.
appearance.
Welcome
Second
back.
appearance, but don't look back at how young I looked last time.
If you looked younger, I can't imagine it.
You were saying it was 12 years?
I think about a dozen years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, before we get started, let me give a shout out to your very talented and kind and beautiful daughter, Katie, who Amanda and I have had occasion to have interaction with through our daughter Rachel, and just tell her hello from the Meyers family.
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, your daughter Rachel, who's a very talented filmmaker, had cast her in a movie a couple of years ago, and that was just a phenomenal experience.
Well, she's quite a talented musician. She plays the violin.
That's right. I guess we work so hard as lawyers and law professors so that our daughters can be artists and musicians, right? You know how it goes.
Well, you hope somebody in your family has talent.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, speaking of theatrics,
Yes.
the political theatrics going on in Washington have been really nonstop now as the nation becomes more and more divided. And the word impeachment gets thrown up on cable television shows, it seems like every 5 minutes in one manner or another by one channel or another. And so, it's been a generation or so since we've really talked about the word impeachment at the presidential level. So let's start with the definition of the word. What does impeachment imply?
Well, technically, impeachment is just simply the constitutional process for removing any federal official from their public office. And I brought along my handy pocket constitution in case you guys didn't have yours this morning.
Thank you. Well, I think I walked off without
Did you?
one.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the key checks and balances that the framers put into the Constitution for Congress to use against the other branches of government. And there's only a few provisions actually in the Constitution that talks about it. If you guys want to take a quick look, I actually flag them for you. There's only three very brief provisions on impeachment. The first tab here, Article 1, Section 2, for those who may be following at home, just simply says, the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. So that's all it says about the House. It doesn't say by supermajority vote. It doesn't give the burden of proof. It just says the House has the sole power of impeachment.
It doesn't set up due process or anything else.
And so I think it's important then to say that the word impeachment does not imply removal of office. It means to try the case. Is that correct?
It's even a step before then. It's more like to charge the federal official.
The charges. So the word impeachment doesn't imply removal.
No. That's the next part, which is Article 1, Section 3. It says the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. And then at the bottom of that paragraph, it says, and no persons shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members of the Senate. So really, the House charges, that's the impeachment, and then the Senate tries, and it takes 2/3 to convict and remove.
Okay. Now, we generally think of the presidency of the United States, and you said all federal officers, but it's the president we're talking about at this point, and that's generally the ones that get the most high profile. So what's the history on that?
Oh gosh, well the history is filled with a rogues gallery of federal officials, not just presidents. In fact, the first person that was impeached was a Tennessee senator, and he was impeached for conspiring with the British to invade U.S. territories, now Louisiana and Florida. In our 200-year history, there's been about a dozen or so federal judges and one justice who's been impeached, and of course 2 presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1868, Bill Clinton in the last generation, and one president, Nixon, of course, who resigned before he could be impeached.
Right.
There's another provision of the Constitution that I want to draw your attention to, which is the grounds for impeachment. It's the next flag that I have up here in the pocket Constitution. It's Article 2, Section 4, and it says the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from the office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so those are the grounds for impeachment: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
And so when we talk about the presidency, as I understand it, Johnson and Clinton were both in their second terms.
Clinton was in his second term. Johnson, I don't remember whether it was his first or second term, but of course Johnson got into office because Lincoln was assassinated.
That's right, so he only served one term, I guess.
That's right, yeah. Johnson was a Democrat, whereas Lincoln was a Republican, but Lincoln wanted to bridge that divide. But Johnson had differences of opinion about Reconstruction, and so the radical Republicans in the Congress opposed him and didn't want him to fire Lincoln's cabinet. So they passed a law called the Tenure in Office Act that said you can't fire officials that the Senate confirmed without the Senate's permission. Right. But nonetheless, Johnson tried to fire the Secretary of War that Lincoln appointed. So Congress, impeached him. The House impeached him for violating that act, and then the Senate tried to convict him, but he survived by one vote.
Oh my!
By a single vote. Yeah. So barely.
Of the 12, I mean, how many have been removed from office? Do you know?
Well, of the federal judges, a dozen or so who've been impeached, I think about 3 or 4 were acquitted. 1 or 2 resigned before they could be convicted, but the rest were convicted and removed from office. There's one judge whose story I think is relevant today to President Trump's fate.
How's that?
And he's a really interesting guy. His name is Walter Nixon, no relation to President Nixon. And he was impeached in the 80s for shenanigans related to bribery and then lying to federal officials and then lying to a federal grand jury. And what's interesting about his case is he was convicted of perjury, to a federal grand jury and imprisoned. But he was still a federal judge because under the Constitution, federal judges enjoy lifetime salary and tenure protection. And so unless he's impeached, he's still a federal judge.
That's the only way to get rid of them.
That's the only way to get rid of him. So this federal judge was sitting in jail and drawing a federal salary.
Where was he a judge? Do you remember?
He was in the swamp in Florida. That's another federal judge. So this one I think was from Louisiana, if I remember correctly. But Congress impeached him and removed him from office. And the thing about his case that's relevant today was that the Senate didn't have a full-blown trial. Instead, it was a committee of the Senate who heard witnesses and received evidence and then made a recommendation to the full Senate to convict him. And the full Senate convicted him. And he said, hold on a second, brother, I didn't get a trial. And under the Constitution, I get a trial. So his case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, we're not touching this. The Constitution says the Senate shall have the sole power to try. And so the judiciary has no say in how much process you get. So therefore, when President Trump now is complaining that he doesn't have process, he doesn't have the right to confront his accusers, if that goes to court, the courts will probably say, you know what, make your argument in front of the House or the Senate or the American people, but not in front of the courts, because we don't have a role in defining what rights you get.
Well, let's go ahead and get this to a break. We'll come back with more with Professor Joseph Ty. He is an expert on constitutional law and teaches at the University of Oklahoma. We'll be right back.
OU Law has a history and heritage that are unparalleled. At the University of Oklahoma College of Law, we empower our students to pursue the career of their dreams. We have the highest U.S. News ranking ever achieved by an Oklahoma law school. We are the first law school in the country to launch a college-wide digital initiative. And this year, our competition teams rank #2 in the nation. OU Law, generations of excellence, limitless possibilities.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to our set of the verdict. We're discussing the word impeachment and its history in the United States Constitution.
Professor, I noticed that you read the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors that follows after treason and bribery, I guess it is.
That's right.
What do you understand the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors to encompass?
Well, first of all, when you look in the little Constitution to try to get an answer to that question, you're not going to get it because the Constitution doesn't define it. So one of the ways that constitutional scholars try to figure out what these words meant is to go back to the time the Constitution was adopted to try to figure out if there's a special meaning to that term. And if you go back to the time of the adoption, over in England, the term high crimes and misdemeanors was basically a term of art under the common law for abuses of the public trust. That would get Crown officials removed by Parliament. And I had brought along another book. This is the Federalist Papers, which were the essays by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison trying to explain and promote the Constitution's adoption. And in Federalist 65, Hamilton basically confirms that view of what high crimes and misdemeanors are. In other words, it's not really crimes, but really abuses of public trust. What Hamilton says in 65 is that the subjects of its jurisdiction, referring to impeachment, are offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. And so certainly crimes could qualify, but it could be things that are not criminal, but still are impeachable offenses. Going back to the case of Walter Nixon, not only did they impeach and remove him for perjury, but they also impeached and removed him for, bringing disrepute on the federal judiciary.
Well, and then he I guess at that point lost his salary.
He lost his salary, yeah. So then he was just a plain federal prisoner with a prisoner number.
Well, what kinds of officials have been impeached besides the president and federal judges?
Yeah, well, there was a Secretary of War, I think this was in the 1870s, serving under Grant, who was impeached. Let's see who else were. Mainly the House and the Senate tend to focus their target either on federal judges or on cabinet officials or on presidents. They don't bother with a smaller fry.
But these folks do not have to be elected; they can be appointed.
That's right, because the word that the Constitution uses let's see, if we go back to Article
Federal officer. Or something?
Article 2, Section 4, it says all civil officers. Civil officers, and so that at least means people who are elected or who are appointed and confirmed by the Senate, including cabinet officials.
Now, is a civil servant a civil officer?
So we haven't had a case that's defined that, but I suppose it could go all the way down. But impeachment is ultimately, I think, a political act. It's a check by one political branch of government against the other branches. And so, if you're going to go after a federal bureaucrat, that's going to take a lot of time and resources and political capital, so it's not worth their while.
If a president were impeached, would the president, after leaving office, still get his lifetime salary and all that? And and Secret Service protection and all that?
The Constitution doesn't say, and so I suppose that would be up to federal law, and that would be an open question. Of course, if you're no longer a federal judge, then you don't draw a salary anymore. But this reminds me of something that F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, and he wrote that there are no second acts in American lives. But that's not the case for people who've been impeached. There was one federal judge, Alcee Hastings, from the swamp in Florida.
I remember him.
You remember
well.
him?
Yes.
Yeah. He was impeached. He was removed from office, but then he ran for the U.S. House of Representatives, and he won, and now he's still there in the House. And so, there could be a second career for presidents who've been impeached.
What do you think is going to be the process here? If the House and Senate were to impeach President Trump, that would have to be accomplished, would it not, before the election? If it is not, and if the election takes place and he does not win a second term, the impeachment's moot, is it not?
I suppose it's only moot once the next president gets sworn in, and so I think a lame duck president who can still wield the powers of the office can still be impeached. But by then, I don't see any political point in doing that. And if we can go back to Federalist 65, what Hamilton said, I think it's really quite prescient. The guy was really smart, and he could see that the process of impeachment is a political process. In fact, he says it here. He says the nature of impeachment can be denominated as political, and he put that in all caps. And then he said the prosecution of them will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community and to divide it into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. And so Hamilton could foresee that impeachment would be politically divisive. And so you got to tread with care. Oh, he certainly did.
At least in today's terms.
Yeah. Maybe that's why he's starring in a musical on Broadway, making a lot of money.
He had a second career.
He did have a second career. He was a forward thinker.
What about the length of the process? I know history is going to tell us that these things can drag on, but I suppose, based on the very generic comments in the Constitution, the House and Senate could act quickly if they chose.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the House can do it in secret, or they can have public hearings. The Constitution doesn't limit the House other than the political repercussions of doing it openly or secretly, and they can move fast or slow. Mitch McConnell has the option of having a vote to dismiss the articles of impeachment right when it lands on the Senate floor, or he could slow play it like he did with Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court. So there's a whole lot of room for play in the joints.
But in the House, it would take a simple majority of House members to vote to impeach.
That's the implication, because Article 1, Section 3 says 2/3 vote by the Senate to convict. It doesn't say anything about the House, and so the House could simply decide majority vote is enough.
Go ahead.
What about, and I know this is off topic slightly, but do all 50 states address the word impeachment in their state constitutions?
So I'm not a scholar of state constitutions, and so I'm not sure that all of them have processes for removal of state officials, but I would think that following the federal constitution, that would be a good idea that most of them probably would have adopted, if not all.
Okay, and I know the state of Oklahoma did impeach one governor back in the 1920s.
Oh, yes.
Governor Walton.
Yeah.
Well, I think in Oklahoma, municipal officers can be impeached.
I know there's recalls, and I hear and read about them across the country.
Is there a difference, I wonder, between a recall and an impeachment?
Gosh, impeachment just sounds a lot worse than recall. we know as lawyers that when you impeach someone's character, right, that means you're saying more than that they're not fit for office. In some ways, you're saying they're just not fit in character.
Well, since you're teaching constitutional law currently at a university, what are your students' comments on all of this? Are they paying attention to the national dialogue, and what type of questions do they pepper you with on the individuality of the current president?
Yeah. Oh gosh, so I've been teaching at OU for almost 20 years now, and when I used to bring up the Federalist papers, I'd get these glazed expressions on students' faces, but now, they just sit up and they are just engaged and hungry to talk about what happened 200 years ago because they see the relevance to what's happening in the headlines today.
Wow. I want to give back in the final segment when we do websites the numbers of the Federalist papers that you looked at and read from. What were they again?
Oh, sure. Yes. So it's Federalist 65 is what I would recommend, and that's when Alexander Hamilton talks about impeachment. There's also another one I would recommend, which is Federalist 51 by James Madison, and that's where he talks about separation of powers and checks and balances.
So you get views from two different folks.
That's right. Hamilton, who believed in a strong federal government, and Madison, of course, who believed in strong state governments.
Well, Professor Type, thank you so much for coming on The Verdict. Our time's gone quickly, and I have to think that our viewers have been more enlightened on the process and the history of it, and what the Constitution actually says about the process.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure always.
It's great to have you. And Kent and I'll be back with a final word after this.
It used to be okay in hospitals. It used to be okay in movie theaters. It was okay in classrooms, restaurants, and airplanes. But thanks to a greater understanding of the dangers, that's not okay anymore. So now that we know secondhand smoke causes lifelong health problems, why is it still okay to smoke with children in the car? Bottom line, it's not okay. Let's get serious about protecting kids. Join the fight at stopswithme.com.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
I really think people are so unaware of the number of kids waiting just in Oklahoma. And I think if more people knew that those children were out there waiting, I think that just by the way we live our lives and the people we talk to, that maybe we can help encourage adoption from Oklahoma.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick, Cornett, and Kent Meyers. We discussed the topic of impeachment with OU law professor Joseph Tye. It's good to see him again.
Well, it is, and you always open this show, or often open this show, with the phrase that we try to bring our viewers something that's timely. Mm-hmm. And boy, we did today.
And we know some of our viewers might want even more information beyond the Constitution, and Professor Tye talked about the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton's work on paper 51, and James Madison on 51 and Alexander Hamilton on 65. You can Google that and get more information from the Federalist Papers on what the framers of the Constitution were thinking about. And we have some website information. You can get more information on Professor Tye and his colleagues at OU at law.ou.edu. And we have a website, theverdict.tv. You can log on and tell us about a guest you'd like to see or a topic you'd like to hear us discuss. And we will, of course, be watching with interest as the House and the Senate deliberate on the topic of impeachment. And, of course, it'll be nonstop on all your cable network news. We'll be back next week with another show. We'll see you then.